Okay, so this video is about making 180-degree curves. We need to do a couple of things before we're ready to start bending wire. The first thing we need to do is figure out the diameter of both the outside and the inside of the curve, because these are going to be independent wires that we're going to have to bend. So I got to figure out what the diameter of each curve will be. Our tracks are a half inch apart. So depending on what I want the entire curve to be, the diameter of the entire curve, or this distance from the farthest track to the farthest track, and then I'm going to figure out what the distance is between this one right here. So using this cone right here, we can determine what the size of our curve will be. It's all labeled 5 inch, 4.5 inch, 4 inch, 3.5 inch, 3 inch, 2 inch, so on and so forth. And another thing to keep in mind is before you do anything, you need to actually physically measure how big you want your curve to be. And most of that will be dependent on the space that you have to work with. So if you want a 5-inch curve, that's a pretty wide curve. That's also a more gradual curve, so the ball will be less likely to fall off or experience any trouble. Or if you want a really tight curve, then you're going to want a 3-inch diameter, something like that. But you can determine based on the amount of space that you have, but I recommend that you measure it first. So, again, back to this. All of our tracks are a ½ inch apart. So here, I'm going to do a 5-inch curve, which is a pretty big curve. So that means because there needs to be a ½ inch on each side, that my inner track is only going to be 4 inches because I want an ½ inch gap on each side. Okay, cool. So now we're going to go. Okay, so before I start bending my wires, we're going to have to solder these or braze them eventually anyways. So I'm just going to sand them down right now because it's a lot easier to sand them when they're straight than it is when they are curved. So I'm going to take both my inside curve and my outside curve and sand them down. Okay, and then eventually I'm going to need some supports to connect this together too. But now I'm ready to start bending. So I'm going to take a cone like this that's labeled. First I'm going to start with my,
twist it.
Okay, here you go.
There we go.
So you can see it's labeled, very loosely drawn. But I'm going to use the 5-inch section for my outside curve. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to wrap it around real tight, following along with the line until it's just about like so. It's kind of like a horseshoe. And you can see that I want this track to be parallel with this track. So I want the distance between them to be the same. Okay? And that doesn't have to be perfect. You can kind of adjust it after you pull it off here. But just like I said earlier, I want a ½ inch between each side. So I want a 4-inch for my inside track here. So I'm going to get it to the 4-inch spot, wrap it around like so, until I have some parallel tracks right here, just like so. You notice when I put this down, it's pretty close to a ½ inch on each side. Now these aren't going to be perfect, so you might have to make some adjustments, like I will here, because I want it to be about a ½ inch. But that's pretty darn good. Pretty close. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I want to put this together. And I'm going to do so by again using my fancy jigs here. So I'm going to put my outside track on the two outside, there we go, on the two outside grooves right here. And then my inside track will go on the inside grooves. And that will keep me nice and perfectly spaced just like the rest of my track. Okay, cool. And then the very tip of the curve here, you kind of have to adjust by hand by moving the track inward or outward depending on whether it's too wide or too skinny. You can kind of eyeball it based on what the rest of the track looks like. So this is pretty darn close. Okay, now I'm ready